All right, it is now 10 o'clock. We will begin the webinar. So, welcome to webinar number 5, Social Media Use, Health Effects, Problems, and Solutions. Once again, welcome. So, most people use social media. However, I'm not sure many of you are aware of the benefits and risks of using social media. So, we'll cover these in the webinar, and this webinar is specifically aimed towards adolescent social media use. However, some of the tips may apply for adult social media use too. But before we begin, who am I? I am Vinay Kanva, one of the co-founders of Live Well Teens. Live Well Teens is a blog that is dedicated to educating teens, tweens, and others about issues affecting the adolescent age group. We publish blog posts on our website and have webinars like the one you're sitting in right now. And about our webinars. So in the spirit of teaching teens and tweens about health issues that affect their age group, we have 2 different webinars in order to accommodate differing learning styles. The formal webinar and the casual webinar. The formal webinar is the one you're sitting in right now. The format of each webinar should be self-explanatory from the name. Okay, so before we actually start with the content, I'll go over the main idea and the webinar topics. So the main idea. Teenagers can use social media, but they should use it safely, sparingly, and responsibly. And that applies to adults too. And our webinar topics. So we're going to talk about social media addiction and the different aspects and monetary aspects of social media use. We'll also talk about the negative impacts on health and potential positive impacts on health. Finally, we'll discuss solutions and some tips for teens and adults. Just a quick disclaimer, the information presented in this webinar is for educational purposes only and does not take precedence over the advice, guidance, and/or counseling of a primary care physician, pediatrician, or other medical specialist, say a psychiatrist or neurologist. So, let's get started. So, let's talk about the evolution of social media. So, social media, well, the first rudimentary version of social media was first developed in the 1950s, when phone phreaking began. This is when electronic devices used telephone networks for free, that is, without paying. Freaks hacked into unused phone inboxes and were able to rely on telephone networks. Email actually began in the 1960s, and social media websites first were developed in the 1970s. However, social media really became popular in the 90s and the 2000s. Now let's talk about social media and the brain. So, use of social media actually is interesting when it comes. Using social media has interesting effects on the brain, as you can see here. So, as you can see, social media use causes, when you see likes or comments on your posts or images, your brain releases dopamine. This dopamine activates your reward centers of your brain, which cause feelings of pleasure which cause you to feel pleasurable. So social media use, which causes you to use social media more in order to recreate that dopamine release. As you might see here, that's pretty similar to how addiction works, except the only difference is social media has been replaced with addictive substance use. So social media can be as addictive as smoking or alcohol. Now, what's the difference between addiction and dependence? Well, this diagram summarizes that. So there are 2 different types of addiction, physical and mental. Well, there's only one type of dependence. So addiction is a reliance on a substance. Well, reliance on a substance for pleasurable feelings. Physical addiction means that your body needs it to feel well. So let's say that you drink alcohol. If your body wanted to feel well and you were addicted to alcohol, then you would keep drinking alcohol because it makes your body feel better. Mental addiction, by comparison, is when your brain needs a substance to feel good. So if you drink alcohol, or say use social media, then you're addicted, then your brain needs you to drink alcohol or use social media in order for you to feel good in your brain. Dependence, by comparison, is an over-reliance on a substance in order for maintenance of life. So, for example, if you use social media and someone were to take it away from you, if you were dependent, you would really complain. You would feel anxious and tense every day if you couldn't use social media. That's if you were addicted. So now let's talk a little bit about adolescent brain development, as the information here will probably come into use later in the webinar. So a review article in the Annals of the New York Academy of Sciences explains adolescent brain development. So adolescents experience changes to the frontal limbic regions of the brain. Thus, adolescent behavior can become extremely risky. But why would adolescents act in a risky way? Well, adolescents often act based on peer influence. So if peers are doing something risky, then adolescents will copy them. And adolescents rely on feelings instead of logic when making decisions, and often only use logic in hypothetical situations. So you could say that adolescents develop their intellect first, and their impulse control second. But this is general. People are different. In addition, many adolescents can act like adults, but cannot control their impulses well. All right, now let's talk about the social media websites. So this figure contains two different graphs sourced from Our World in Data, a project based at Oxford University. So this is the total number of people using social media platforms in a month. Well, average monthly active users across the world. I mean, the United States does not have a population of 2.26 billion. As you can see, Facebook, YouTube, and Instagram are extremely popular. And Instagram and WeChat both have the same number of users. I'm pretty sure you've heard of TikTok nowadays because there's a controversy regarding it, and some countries are either considering a ban or have already banned TikTok. Well, it seems that it is popular, with 500 million active monthly users on average. And as for this second chart shows the percentage of men and women using social media platforms in the U.S. This is use among women, and this is use among men. So Facebook is used by about 60% of men, and about 70 to 80% of women. Interesting, huh? So now I'm pretty sure you're wondering, what are the health consequences of social media? I mean, in all the previous webinars, we discussed medical and health-related topics. Well, this is where it gets fun. So social media use can negatively affect your physical, mental, and social health. And we'll discuss social media's health effects in those three areas. So we'll discuss, for physical health, we'll discuss sedentary lifestyle and sleep. So let's start with sedentary lifestyle. So a systematic review and harmonized meta-analysis of 8 different studies found that, quote, less time spent sedentary is quote, associated with substantially reduced risk for premature mortality. Note that all the studies were based in the US and Europe, which could limit total generalizability, but as for the US, that's what I can tell you. Another study of more than 67,000 adolescents found that auto depression increased for being sedentary for 3 or more hours. This cross-sectional study found an association between being sedentary and risk of depression, but not a causation. Something to note for cross-sectional studies, and because cross-sectional studies will come up a lot in this presentation, they can only determine correlation. They cannot determine causation. So when A happens, B happens too. But that doesn't mean that A causes B. They're simply associated with each other. And the paper itself mentions that more longitudinal studies are needed to confirm the conclusion. Now we get to another systematic review paper published in PLOS One, a famous open access journal, where authors qualitatively synthesized 31 studies and meta-analyzed 5 studies. Sedentary behavior was found to correlate with reduced health-related quality of life in both longitudinal and cross-sectional studies analyzed. And the final one we'll discuss was a systematic review conducted last year of 31 studies and a meta-analysis of 17 studies. 14 were excluded in the meta-analysis. Sedentary behavior is weakly associated with anxiety, and while the association still exists, it must be investigated further. So what I can tell you is, based on the current evidence that I've reviewed here, sedentary lifestyle, well, you should not be sedentary a lot. Now, what about sleep? Well, sleep gets interesting. This table summarizes the four different studies that we'll be talking about today when in relation to sleep. So the first study we'll discuss, the first paper we'll discuss was published in BMJ Open. It was an analysis of 13 to 15-year-olds in the UK Millennium cohort. So this is a cross-sectional cohort study. So authors analyzed 6 areas of sleep in the 11,872 participants. 13.9% of the cohort were high users of social media, 20.8% were very high users of social media, and 33.7% were low users of social media. In this cohort, females used social media more than males did. And what did the authors find? Well, higher social media use was associated with late sleep onset. But as I've mentioned before, cross-sectional studies can only determine correlation and not causation. Now let's move on to the second study, which is much larger, with 43,994 participants. It consisted of 8th, 10th, and 12th graders from the Monitoring the Future survey. And the authors found that moderate social media use can affect moderately adequate sleep, but found that that medium intensity of social media use was associated with the lowest sleep adequacy among those with moderate health behaviors. That's a direct quote from the paper. So this cross-sectional survey found that social media use, medium intensity, was associated with low sleep adequacy. So that is low sleep. Now we get to the smaller set. So this paper, published in 2016, analyzed a cross-sectional study of close to 2,000 adolescents between the ages of 19 and 32. The authors found that high and frequent social media use can increase the probability of sleep disturbance. However, because, again, it's cross-sectional, we do not know the direction of this association. So we don't know whether or not social media use causes sleep disturbance or whether or not sleep disturbance causes people to use social media more. So it recommends that follow-up longitudinal studies should be conducted. So in a follow-up study, researchers conduct a study and then leave the participants alone for a while. Then after that time is over, the researchers gather the participants again and then see if they've improved or gotten worse. Just a note. Okay, and the final study we'll be discussing is this one, published a year later, with the same lead author. So young adults aged 19 to 32, similar, but slightly fewer, 1,763, were analyzed in this study. The authors found that social media use 30 minutes prior to sleep independently disturbs sleep. That is, there's nothing else that is there are no other variables which might change the association. In this nationally representative study, social media use 30 minutes before bed negatively impacted sleep. So based on this evidence, social media use can disrupt sleep. But I recommend that you look through more papers yourself, as it is your job to make sure that you are putting all studies in context. I've tried my best, but I still recommend you keep looking if you wish. So why does this association exist exactly? I'm pretty sure you're wondering. So the first study that I talked about explained that social media can impact sleep directly, and the authors theorized that using social media can delay activities during the day, which can cause sleep to be postponed. The third study that I mentioned also comes to this conclusion. Finally, computer or phone blue light may impact sleep, specifically the circadian rhythm and REM sleep. For more information on REM sleep and the circadian rhythm, you should watch my sleep webinar, which is available as a recording on livewellteens.org. But anyways, now let's move on to mental health. It turns out many aspects of youth mental health are negatively impacted by social media use, and life-threatening problems can occur. So let's start with FOMO, or fear of missing out. So what is FOMO exactly? So one paper said that FOMO is defined as, quote, feelings of anxiety that arise from the realization that you may be missing out on rewarding experiences that others are having. One study in 2018 analyzed 2,663 teenagers in Flanders, which is a region of Belgium. The study found that fear of missing out is a predictor of problematic social media use, in addition with phubbing. If you don't know what phubbing is, it's basically snubbing with the cell phone. And if you don't know what snubbing is, which is okay, snubbing is ignoring someone when they're talking to you. So let's say I'm talking to someone. If I'm phubbing, then I'm listening to them, but I'm also looking at my phone. It turns out that adolescents with FOMO are also more likely to overuse their smartphones. All right, so what about social media addiction? Well, a review paper published in the International Journal of Environmental Research and Public Health, ooh, that's a long name, found that excess social networking site use is associated with the same symptoms that drug addicts have. If you remember from the beginning, we talked about how social media addiction is pretty similar to other types of addiction. Symptoms of social media addiction include mood modification, withdrawal symptoms, and relapse. And FOMO may actually play a role in this, fear of missing out. The association was found with Facebook, but not with other social media websites. It turns out those with FOMO use Facebook more often, had lower mood and well-being, lower life satisfaction, and use social media inappropriately. All right, now we get to depression. Sorry, I hope not to depress you. So this table summarizes 5 different studies about social media use and depression. So the first one was published in 2019 in the journal JAMA Pediatrics, which, by the way, is actually one of prestigious journal of pediatrics. 3,826 adolescents were analyzed in this study. They were all from a randomized clinical trial on a drug and alcohol use prevention program. So while the study analyzed electronics, it did explain that adolescent use of social media was associated with depression. And this cohort study explained, and this paper explained, that, quote, exposure to idealized images triggers depression. You'll understand what I mean in a bit. So this cohort study concludes that social media use is associated with depression. All right, now let's move on to another one. So this study analyzed students from 9 different secondary schools in a city in China that is near Hong Kong, by the way. So 5,365 students were analyzed. So the authors found that online social networking was associated with depression, and depression was associated with using social networking sites more in this prospective cohort study. Oh, just a side note, in the hierarchy of medical evidence, prospective cohort studies are second to randomized controlled trials. So what I can tell you is there is a bidirectional association between social media and depression. Although there's potential for recall bias, and this may not be generalizable because it's Chinese students. But based on this study, that's what I can tell you. Another study, and which happened earlier, was a study of 1,787 young adults, aged between 19 and 32. It was a nationally representative sample of youth in the U.S. This study also concluded that social media use was associated with depression. This cross-sectional study found that. But again, it cannot confirm that social media use causes depression. It can confirm that it was associated with it. And then there's a cluster analysis paper from 2018, published in the American Journal of Health Behavior, which found that not all patterns of social media use are associated with depression. So this paper analyzed 1,730 young people between the ages of 19 and 32. There are 4 different categories. Well, there are 5 different categories of people, and I have 4 of them here. So there were unplugged people, concentrated and diffuse dabblers, connected people, and wired people. People in the connected and wired groups wired groups had higher risk of depression and anxiety, apparently. So if you are totally dependent on social media in this study, or near dependent, then you might have higher risk of depression. But if you're using it moderately or very little, then probably not. Now, you might be wondering why I say study selection criteria in this column. Well, that's because the last study that I'm going to talk about was a systematic review. For those of you who don't remember or don't know, a systematic review is a study of different studies. Researchers look for all available articles on a topic using in certain databases. The Cochrane database of systematic reviews is often used, in addition to PubMed and some PubMed, Scopus, and other medical databases. So then, after compiling all of the evidence they could find, based on certain selection criteria, studies are systematically screened and either included or excluded. Then the studies that are left are analyzed to make sure that there are no flaws with the evidence or anything. Then, after studies with bad methods or other flaws are excluded, and whatever evidence is left is then analyzed to draw conclusions. Some systematic reviews can review 5 papers, but there are others that review 4,000. And there's actually a systematic review that reviewed thousands of papers on curcumin. But anyways, so this systematic review from 2016 analyzed studies that met the following criteria. Studies that focused on behavioral social networking site use, had results addressing anxiety or depression, and were English language articles published after 2005 in peer-reviewed journals. Yes, there are some journals that aren't peer-reviewed. But anyways, 70 papers met these inclusion criteria. And this systematic review was inconclusive because there were mixed findings in all 70 papers. So we have no certain conclusion from the systematic review. So what I can tell you is, while the first 4 studies that I mentioned found that social media use was associated with depression, the systematic review did not find this association because probably systematic reviews analyze more evidence, which means that they can look for both pro and con. Okay, but why does this association potentially exist if it were to? Well, the first paper that I mentioned suggests, quote, repeated exposure to idealized images lowers adolescent self-esteem, triggers depression, and enhances depression over time. I mean, if you're being exposed to perfect images of someone's lifestyle, you're obviously going to become jealous and want to live like them, which might cause you to feel worse about yourself. In addition, social media addicts may also be harmed by the content that they view on social media sites. The second study that I mentioned proposes that depressed individuals may just find social networking as a way to be anonymous online and to not need to use social cues. But social media use can worsen depression. Okay, I'd just like to briefly address anxiety. So one of the studies that I mentioned found the same conclusions for anxiety as it did depression. And the systematic review also found that the evidence on whether or not social media use is associated with anxiety is mixed. So, yeah. All right, so now let's move on to body image. So, here's the table again. So, these studies are smaller, but these cross-sectional studies are smaller, just warning you. So, the first study was analyzed women at a university in Spain, 168 women. And it found that social media use was associated with negative body image. The author said that thin ideal is widespread. That is the idea that you need to be thin, which might cause people to view their body negatively. If you don't know what body image is the way you view your body. So if you view yourself as too fat or too thin, that's negative body image. But if you view your body as this is my body, it's perfect the way it is, that's positive body image. So just to note, this is a small study, it's not generalizable to other populations. Other cultural factors were not examined, and it's cross-sectional studies, so association, not causation. Okay, so the first study finds that social media use is associated with negative body image. What about another one? Well, this one analyzed Dutch adolescents who answered a survey online. 604 of them. That is more than the earlier study. This cross-sectional study also found that social networking website use was associated with negative body image. That is, in both genders. You might be surprised. Although we probably know that body image is a problem among females, it's actually a problem among males too. I mean, many boys are pressured to look strong on social media too. So we need to analyze both genders. So the limit, however, just note that there was only one website examined in this study, and that it was cross-sectional, obviously. But what I can tell you is, based on these two studies, social media use was associated with negative body image. All right. Now, the authors of this one also published another paper later, and this one was analyzed a smaller study of 440 people, but these were adolescents in school between the ages of 12 and 19. The authors found that social media use was associated with body image problems in both genders. So same conclusion as the previous one. This cross-sectional study came to the same conclusion. The final study I'll discuss was a paper in the journal Body Image. 118 female undergraduate students from York University were analyzed. The authors found that viewing social media images negatively impacted body image in the study population, but did not mention what type of study it was. However, note that this study was small, not generalizable, and there was a potential for response bias. That is, a response bias. So, again, why? Well, the first study that I mentioned suggests that body dissatisfaction can lead to negative body image. And the third study I mentioned suggests that social media, quote, exposes adolescents to appearance-related messages. That is, negative ones, sometimes. As for eating disorders, while I would love to present to you another table, I only found two studies for social media and eating disorders. The first one analyzed about 1,000 adolescents in grades 7 through 8. Using social media was associated with disordered eating. Children with Snapchat, Facebook, Instagram, and Tumblr were significantly more likely to have disordered eating. So here's what happened for both boys and girls. So children with Snapchat, both genders, boys on Facebook and Instagram, and girls on Tumblr suffered from disordered eating. This cross-sectional study could not establish any causation, only correlation, though. A larger study, though, was analyzed in a paper published in the Journal of the Academy of Nutrition and Dietetics. It was a cross-sectional survey of 1,765 adolescents between the ages of 19 and 32. Social media use was associated with eating concerns. But why? Well, a possible explanation might be that social media users are exposed to images, which presents an eating concern risk. Or it might be that people with eating problems might use social media more and encounter pro-eating disorder groups. However, again, both of these studies were cross-sectional, so we don't know whether or not it's causation or association. Well, whether or not social media can cause people to develop eating disorders. All right, so that must have been a lot of information. So I'm going to give you a 5-minute break in order for you to digest everything. You can take a drink of water. You can eat a snack. You can finish up your notes, but please do not scroll your social media feed. All right. I hope you enjoyed your break. We're going to resume the webinar now. All right. So now let's talk about social media use and social health. That is, health when it comes to socializing. So we're going to discuss isolation and cyberbullying. So let's start with isolation. So, a study of 1,787 US young adults aged between 19 and 32 was examined in a paper published in the American Journal of Preventive Medicine. Young adults with high social media use tended to feel more socially isolated than those with lower use. But why? Well, those who are isolated may turn to social media as a quote cure for their isolation. And people using social media might be more isolated in general, potentially due to missing authentic social experiences, feeling excluded, and viewing idealized peer lives on computers. Some limitations include the fact that the study was cross-sectional, showing correlation only, and that social media use was self-reported, causing a potential for bias. But you could probably understand why it's cross-sectional, considering the fact that it was the only one that examined social media use and social isolation that at least I was able to find. Sorry, excuse me. Based on this study, it is possible that using social media can increase your child's social isolation problem, if they have one. All right, so as for cyberbullying, I'm going to talk about two different meta-analyses on the topic. So the first systematic review paper was published in the Journal of Medical Internet Research, and it concluded that cyberbullying increases suicide risk. 33 articles about 26 different studies were selected. All studies were observational and sadly potentially biased. But despite this, cyberbullying can increase suicide risk. Another meta-analysis of 36 different studies found that peer victimization was related to suicide. It applies to children and adolescents of all ages and both genders. Although there was no distinction between verbal and physical victimization and how much of a role peer victimization plays in suicide. So we know that it is associated with suicide, but we don't know how much. Cyberbullying is, quote, a growing problem associated with social media use. A majority of children 12 to 18 were cyberbullied at least twice in the previous year. Cyberbullying can cause symptoms of mental health problems, such as depression and anxiety disorders, in the words of the authors of one paper. And children can be bullied anywhere. I'm pretty sure that when you were young, for those of you adults out there, you only got bullied in the schoolyard or outside. But the problem is, with cyberbullying, someone can be bullied even in the comfort of their own room. So, what are the potential benefits of social media? Well, here's the thing. Social media is not all bad. And if I were to not include this, I would probably be giving you a very biased picture. So, I'll discuss 3 potential benefits of using social media. And remember, even if they seem to be small on a list, that does not make them small in general. So let's start with maintaining friendships. So a paper published in Helion, a self-press journal, found a correlation between use of WeChat and friendship quality. The study analyzed 508 college students, and participants completed surveys, and then the results were analyzed. Just be a little sympathetic, though, considering the fact that there was only one author for this paper. Okay, but anyways, another study of 44 autistic adolescents, which you can see here, found that social media use can improve friendships. So this is the first study I mentioned, and this is the one I'm talking about right now. So this one was about autistic adolescents. Just keep that in mind. But why do many people suggest the opposite? Well, that's because of certain studies that find the opposite conclusion. One study analyzed 2 different samples of UK adults. This paper was published in a journal. This paper was published in a journal that is published by the Royal Society, which also happens to publish one of the oldest scientific journals in the world. But anyways, so there are 2 different samples of UK adults in this study, and in total there are 3,875 people analyzed. What did the researcher find? Well, social media use can prevent loss of friendships, but face-to-face interaction is still recommended. Friendships must be maintained with occasional face-to-face interaction. The final study we'll discuss is one that we've already discussed earlier, Primack et al. And this study analyzed adults between 19 and 32, if you don't remember. 1,787 people were analyzed in this study. It was found that social media use was associated with increased feelings of isolation. But again, keep in mind that because this is cross-sectional, we don't know whether or not social media use increases is it actually causes people to feel isolated, or whether or not they're associated. But what I can tell you is that cross-sectional study results may be because social media users may just feel isolated in general, or vice versa. So based on this table, you can probably conclude that social media use may improve friendships in some populations, but not in all. What about identity exploration? So adolescents search for their identity both online and offline. So adolescents use social media to self-present and to control peer perceptions. Self-exploration is beneficial because youth can discover themselves. And social media allows adolescents to practice identity development skills. So, in conclusion, adolescents develop their identity or who they are as a person during this time, and social media can provide a safe place for them to do that. What about peer interaction? Well, interestingly enough, an article in the August 2020 issue of Trends in Cognitive Sciences, that is this month's issue, discusses peer influence in adolescents. It turns out adolescents are more likely to behave in risky ways when peers are near them, and adolescents often look to peers and align their behaviors with them. Many adolescents are also hypersensitive to social exclusion, if you remember from the beginning. One paper actually documented a study of 34 adolescents. Don't worry, this is probably the most interesting study you will hear about. Study subjects were asked to view images on Instagram while inside an fMRI scanner. That is, a scanner using magnetic resonance imaging. Each person saw 148 different images. 42 showed risky behavior, and 40 were the wrong. And the researchers found some interesting results. Participants viewing images with more, quote, likes had more brain activity in the areas of the brain involved with social behavior. And adolescents tended to like photographs with many likes themselves, suggesting a role of peer influence. But how does this relate to a benefit? Well, social media can allow youth to safely interact with peers, and although the risks exist, they can be managed. So before we get to solutions, I'd like to briefly discuss the negative effects of screen time. Let's first talk about sleep. A review of 67 papers published between 1999 and 2014 found a, quote, significant association between screen time and reduced sleep duration. Another review article in the journal Pediatrics supports this conclusion too. And some potential causes include the fact that light from electronic devices can contribute to hyperarousal and decreased sleepiness, and exposure to screens suppresses melatonin. For more information, you should visit my sleep webinar, available as a recording on livewellteens.org. So what about obesity? Well, a review paper in Pediatrics states exposure to electronics is associated with obesity too. Now, here's where things get interesting, the reasoning. You might think that children and adolescents might become obese because they're not being active, but that's actually unlikely, according to this paper. Perhaps a more likely reason would be energy intake. Children who are on electronics more also tend to eat fewer fruits and vegetables and more junk food. Children on electronics are also exposed to more food advertising, and sleep deprivation itself is associated with weight gain. And for more information on sleep deprivation, you should visit the sleep webinar. What about behavioral problems? Well, a cross-sectional study of 621 people concluded that children and adolescent use of electronics was associated with behavioral problems. It may be because of sleep, but who knows? Because electronics use disrupts sleep, that might lead to behavioral problems. All right, so now that we've gone through the content-heavy portion, let's talk about some solutions. There are many different ways you can address risks of social media, so we'll discuss solutions in the context of physical, mental, and social health. So for sedentary lifestyle, I would say exercise more. And yes, that is easy to say but hard to do. So what I recommend is, for adolescents, they should get peer support. Now remember, peer pressure is not all bad. There are certain types of peer pressure that can be good too. I mean, if your peers are pressuring you to study hard for a test, that's not bad peer pressure at all. So if you are struggling to wish to exercise, you should ask some peers to challenge you to exercise, and they can challenge you too. As for sleep, the American Academy of Pediatrics recommends that clinicians talk to parents and ask them to remove electronics from a teen's bedroom. and explain why sleep is important to. And clinicians are also recommended to explain to families why sleep is extremely important. What about mental health? Well, let's start with FOMO. So, a review article from Pediatrics examined cross-sectional and longitudinal studies, 40 of them, and found that physical activity can decrease depression. And it's also been proven for anxiety. And yeah, according to one article in the Annals of Behavioral Medicine, it was a systematic review of 12 randomized controlled trials. So, for depression and anxiety, I recommend you consume a plant-based diet and get some exercise. For more information on that, you should visit the Stress, Depression, and Anxiety webinar, available as a recording on liberalteens.org too. What about FOMO? For FOMO and addiction, you should talk to your doctor and take a social media detox. What I mean by that is, you should completely eliminate using social media for some time, but be careful. Because you could, just like how people addicted to smoking may experience nicotine withdrawal symptoms when taking off cigarettes immediately, you should be careful because you might feel anxious and might suffer health consequences if you don't do this properly. So talk to your doctor. What about body image and eating disorders? So as for this, you should also take a social media detox, that is, stop using it entirely, and talk to your doctor about that. In addition, it might be useful to talk to your parents and or a trusted friend. Your doctor can give you medical support, while your parents and friends that you trust can give you emotional support. So, as for social health, for isolation problems, you should talk to your doctor or a trusted friend. And for cyberbullying, not only should you talk to a trusted friend or parent, but you should report any incident of cyberbullying. If necessary, contact a law enforcement officer, as they can probably help you. So what are some pros and cons of social media use? These are the benefits, and these are potential risks. So you might think that it might be bad to use social media, but not necessarily. These are all very important things that these are all very important in the time of adolescence. Adolescents need to interact with their peers. They need to explore their identity, and they need to maintain friendships. They need to learn that stuff. And if they're not getting enough of that experience in person, then social media might be good for them. You just have to keep the risks in mind and find out how you can balance the risks and still retain the benefits. So, what are some tips for parents and others? So here's what I recommend. You should monitor your adolescent's social media use as best as you can. However, you should talk to your teen first and ask them whether or not they like it. And you should be careful how you present it. Many teens want to be independent, and if you present it incorrectly, if you present what you want to do incorrectly, then your adolescent might show resistance. But that's up to you. I'm pretty sure that you can decide for yourself how you want to do it. The second thing you should do is watch actively for signs of social media addiction or for any adverse consequences. So, for example, if your adolescent seems to be more isolated now, then maybe that's a problem, and you should probably help them. Also, you should tell your teen or teenagers the facts about social media, but still let them decide for themselves. Providing them some independence will allow them to learn in a safe way. And it's important that teens learn how to learn from failure or mistakes. And as in every webinar, I've provided a talking to your teen section. So these are 3 questions that you should ask your teen. So first, ask them if there's anyone that they follow or like on social media. If they can't give you an exact list, you can ask them what types of images or what types of posts they like to like or follow. If that can give you insight into what your teen is interested in, and you can probably find alternatives if necessary. Also ask them if they feel bullied or hurt by anyone on social media sites. But make sure you're careful with this, as many times bullies can threaten teens who are being bullied by saying that they'll do something bad to them if the bullied person tells their parents. But you should remind them that these threats rarely come true, rarely actually happen, unless the teen has given personal information away. And even if they have, you can always contact law enforcement in order to deal with cyberbullying. The final thing you should remember is to remind your teen that you are always there for them. While teens want to be independent, you should remember that teens are still reliant on parents, at least to some degree. All right, so in summary, so we discussed social media addiction and many and monetary aspects of social media use. We also discussed the negative and positive impacts of social media use on health, in addition to some solutions and some tips for teens and adults. So the main idea: teenagers can use social media, but they should use it safely, sparingly, and responsibly. So here are some recommended resources. If you need help with an addiction, you should visit a clinical psychologist, a behavioral therapist, or your psychiatrist. But I recommend that you visit your primary care physician first, because he or she can determine whether or not your addiction is severe enough. You can also find internet addiction camps in your local area. In some countries, laws have been passed that allow for people who are addicted to the internet to go to a camp without internet, so that their addiction can be treated. See if there are any internet addiction camps in your local area, and you might be able to get the same experience. But I still recommend that you talk to your doctor before doing any of these things. So here's some credits. Thank you to Slides Carnival for this very beautiful template, and for Font Awesome for providing many of the icons used throughout the presentation. So thank you for attending. We appreciate your attendance at the webinar. So I'm going to go over the Q&A session guidelines. So I would absolutely love to take your questions. I might not have explained things clearly for you, so you can ask clarifying questions or just questions about anything related to social media. My only requirement is that you do not ask me any personal medical questions, as those should be directed towards your primary care doctor, psychiatrist, or other medical specialist. So I'll give you a 5-minute break for you to think about your questions, and then I'll start answering. Please think about your questions. Okay, I'll just start answering questions. Okay, so anyways, I'm going to start answering questions. So I received a question in chat, a basic question: what is done in media detox? So that's actually a really good question. So in a social media detox, you completely. Okay, I'll just start answering questions. So you either completely or partially stop using social media. The purpose of a social media detox is to stop being addicted to social media, obviously. So just to summarize, in a media detox, you completely stop using social media, or you partially stop using social media. The goal is to address your addiction problem. Another question I received: do teenagers grow out of being internet dependent when they become adults? Well, that depends. If a teen has received counseling or anything, or if they've decided to take a media detox, then perhaps they would not be internet dependent. Although in general, adolescent addictions tend to carry on in adulthood, and they're harder to quit than addictions during adulthood. Oh, Save's message was restricted, but either way, thank you for that question. If there are any other questions, I'm still available until 11 o'clock. Hello, are there any other questions? Don't be afraid to ask me any questions about social media. I can answer anything. Oh, I received a question. Could you list a couple of social networks that have more pros than cons? That's actually a really good question. So I would like, please give me 1 second. I will pull up a chart very quickly. Oh, okay. So I found a chart on the website Statista, which publishes charts, that that found that examined results from the Royal Society for Public Health survey among 1,479 young people. So in this chart, YouTube had a net positive impact, but Twitter, Facebook, Snapchat, and Instagram had a net negative impact. If you wish, I can post the link to. I will post the link in chat. So give me 1 second for that. All right, so the link is in chat. Anyways, so the second question I received was, do adolescents give correct feedback to parents when questioned about the issues of social media exposure? It depends. If an adolescent does not trust their parents, probably they might lie. But if adolescents trust their parents, then they probably are more likely to tell the truth. But what I will tell you is, parents should try their best to ensure that their adolescents will trust them. That is, they should remain calm when talking to their adolescents, and show more curiosity than knowing the answer. If it doesn't work, then what I can tell you is, each adolescent is different and each parent is different. So you should try different parenting methods until you find one that works. Q&A will be ending in 3 minutes. So if you have any other questions, please ask me. Please ask right now. Once again, don't feel anxious to ask any questions. I can answer anything. Just make sure they're not personal medical questions. Oh, okay. No, I don't believe so. I did not look through any evidence that talked about 6-year-olds because if they're on Facebook, then they're technically on it illicitly because of the Child Online Privacy Protection Act. Thus, unless there's parental consent under that act, websites are not allowed to allow any kids under 13 to sign up. But in general, because tech companies don't know whether or not parents have approved, they just have a 13-year-old requirement. So what I would say, I didn't come across any studies on that. Oh, so I received a question. I've come across 6-year-olds with Facebook accounts and requested me to NE their friends. In your studies, did you come across this aspect? Well, no, I did not. Most of the research that I looked at was for adolescents specifically. What I can tell you is 6-year-olds should not be on Facebook because of the Child Online Privacy Protection Act, or COPPA. Any child under 13 should not sign up for a website without parental consent. And because tech companies unfortunately don't know whether or not a parent consents to a child being on a website, they just have a 13-year-old requirement for signing up. So 6-year-olds with Facebook accounts should not have them. If Facebook catches them, then their accounts will be deleted. So if anyone has a Facebook account and they're under the age of 13, then they should not. Then their account. Then they should either delete their account immediately, and unless they're 13. All right. So it looks like it is now 11 o'clock. So Q&A is over. Thank you very much for attending this series of webinars, and I'll see you soon.